In the name of Allah, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this roundtable for the invitation. My name is Khodor Taleb. I come from Lebanon. I used to be advisor to the presidential administration. I would like to tell you that we definitely should seek to promote and develop our meetings and clarify, specify the subjects, the issues of our presentations. Maybe we should have various platforms or directions and we should be discussing our issues in accordance with these various directions, so that we wouldn't be repeating each other's ideas from one presentation or intervention to another. I think we should look for some very serious and specific results. At the same time, I would like to point you to the fact that we must give a clear definition of extremism. Rather than be speaking of terrorism, in brief, I believe we must give a very clear-cut definition for extremism. We must unearth and expose its historic roots and expose the connection, the links between extremists and terrorists, because extremism is an ideology, is a type of ideology which can have various social manifestations. At its heart lie some very specific ideological principles or values which are interpreted very narrowly and very in a very biased way. A lot of these values are really rooted in the prehistoric origins of humankind, the deep, selfish motives of the human psyche. We can probably split up extremism into three types. The extremism of groups, the extremism of individuals, and government extremism. We could remember the biblical story of Abel and Cain. And then instances in history where historic figures, where personalities would be worshipped as gods. I don't want to go into detail of history, but there are certain trends and developments for advocating extremism or even promoting it. Therefore, I would like to draw this line. Extremism feeds on various issues and various injustices. For instance, the occupation of there's an issue whether occupation can be viewed as terrorism, and whether you should view opposition or armed resistance to occupation as terrorism. Maybe we should revise and revisit some of those definitions, because sometimes terrorism can serve as a politicized label stuck onto a resistance movement, in essence. I believe we need to see the distinction between those who do terror while occupying others, doing occupation, and those who try to resist them. Those who pursue occupation employ terror to solidify their rule, whereas local population that resists, they have to resist for themselves. A hadith says that those who die for their country, for their land, shall become martyrs. This brings us to the issue of so-called terrorism. Foreign occupation, is a crucial factor in breeding terrorism, in inciting terrorism. Let's think of who pushes us towards terrorism. Terrorism, is it action or counteraction? Is it a reaction to some oppression, be it foreign occupation or an oppressive government? Because they are really the culprits. They are the ones who give rise to terrorism in the first place. And later on, terrorism that starts as resistance to occupation or to oppression, it can then take on religious forms or political forms or other ways of forms. Also, there can be cases when believers are prevented arbitrarily from being able to worship and practice their religion. This also provokes people into doing acts of terrorism. It is important that those who support this type of extremist action, they always pursue some political objectives. If we remember the origins of Al Qaeda, you sure do remember that originally it was the godless Soviet Union who killed Muslims in the territory of Afghanistan, and this urged Mujahideen to rise to fight Soviet occupation. And when the Soviets were gone from Afghanistan and the Mujahideen started going back to their home countries from Afghanistan after the end of the war, their local governments started throwing them in jail, started imprisoning them and cracking down on them. And including some of the countries that used to support those very Mujahideen back in the day. This is in part how the Taliban movement came to be, how it emerged, and the same goes for ISIS. Once such an organization becomes unnecessary, unwanted by its initial sponsors, it will follow the same fate as has the Taliban and the Mujahideen. Being in my professional capacity as an advisor to the presidential administration back in the 1980s, I witnessed a lot. I come myself from northern Lebanon, and there was a movement that originated in northern Islam, and it later founded an emirate in the city of Tripoli. This emirate was initially intended as a counterbalance to the PLA in this opposition, in this confrontation between Palestinians and the Syrian Arab Republic. Another instance was in 1999 when in Lebanon many Al Qaeda veterans established a paramilitary organization based in the mountains of northern Lebanon. They sought refuge from the crackdown from the security forces, and members of that organization would join Jarud. And they were they sought a negotiation with the Americans. The third instance, the third example is the war in Syria that we are witnessing right now. Lebanon has effectively turned into a platform for smuggling and trafficking arms and militants into Syria. So they are passing through our country. All these three historic examples, which I have witnessed myself firsthand, they prove that financial, political, or personal interests lead to the emergence of such extremist groups and movements. Therefore, extremism is not a child of our societies. It's not something that it's not a product of our societies. It merely uses a religious agenda, and such developments also took place back in the day in the United States and Europe. But today, extremism, it unites many different groups, and countries have to, and people have to cooperate with this kind of extremist organizations that impose on them their own projections of reality, their own versions of reality. So what are journalists to do to contribute to opposing extremism in our respective countries? We must engage in a war of ideology. We see that the West is now losing this war against extremism, and I think the reason for that is the fact that we've been unable to give an adequate assessment to the past and present. We should divide media outlets into three categories. It's mass media as such, social media, social conditions play an important role. As for missionary organizations and institutions and mosques, which sometimes serve as places that accumulate believers, I believe we need to devise a special strategy for opposing extremism in order to choose a golden medium in Islam. Extremism does not have definitive geographic borders. It's become a global phenomenon. And therefore, we need to devise realistic, reasonable means of combating extremism. We need to do away with the incentives that contribute to spreading extremism. We must oppose Israeli extremism, Israeli terrorism. We need to insist on establishing a Palestinian state with its capital in Jerusalem. Thank you.